Welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe, whoever you love, whatever you don't believe, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll. I'm a religious educator here at the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. And today is our 33rd lecture on biblical scholarship and literacy. Thank you. All that really means is I'm going really slowly and probably at a greater depth than anyone but me finds interesting. I apologize for that, but I hope I found some interest in the things we've shared. This is our first lecture of 2025. Again, I'm excited about that. This is going to be an interesting year, and so buckle up, hold tight, and this is going to be fun. This is our class webpage. I'm gonna try to get, I think, a better domain name for this so that people can find it more easily. But right now, sites.google.com, view biblical scholarship and literacy, and there you'll get links to all the past lectures, so you can find them if you want to watch them. I do record them all. I put them all on YouTube, and so if you miss anything or want to watch a past one, they're all here. Links to the past ones are here, and links to handouts, additional resources, extra things you can read if you're interested are all there as well. There's also a QR code if you're busy with a cell phone and want to capture the QR code. So last time, we talked about the book of Joshua. We did that in two parts, one in October and one in November. And we specifically, because the book of Joshua so directly addresses divine violence, divinely sanctioned violence, right? Because they're commanded to commit what we would consider to be genocide by God. We tried to address that very specifically. And there are other forms of religiously inspired, shall we say, violence. And there's at least three approaches to religiously inspired violence. The first is the antagonistic approach that simply is the sort of thing that kind of new atheists will use. And what they'll do is they'll say, well, religion is evil and makes people do horrible things. The other is the apologetic approach, which will say, hey, those Muslims who flew their plane into the buildings, those weren't real Muslims. This is the no true Scotsman fallacy. And the other is to see what I call incremental progress. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So this third approach is somewhere in the middle, and it implies that religion can do good, and it can inspire people to do good, and it can inspire people to do harm, and it can do either one. And so the question is, how do we view that, and how do we address it in a helpful way? And so I base this on three quotes. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And if I have seen further than others, it is because I stand upon the shoulders of giants, and God lets his people tell the story. I'm sure Pete Enns is mortified by being lumped in with Sir Isaac Newton and Martin Luther King Jr. But what we're really saying here is that we may have moral superiority to the past. When we look at things in the past, especially like the book of Judges, and we look at it and say, that is morally reprehensible, I think we should recognize that we see further than our ancestors, not just because we're better people than them, but because we were raised in an environment that recognizes that, and that environment came about through a slow and gradual improvement. It doesn't change the fact that what they did is wrong, period. It's wrong, but we see further than them because we stand on the shoulders of giants, and because we are at a further point along that moral arc. Also, it helps to not think that if we're reading the scriptures of the past, they are perfect reflections of God's will. Because if they are, you're kind of stuck. This is this idea of scriptures. Scriptures are canon. When a religion, whatever religion it is, canonizes some sacred body of texts. So for us, obviously, that would be the Bible, the Hebrew Bible for Jewish people, the Christian Bible, including the New Testament for Christians, but you also get the Quran for Muslims or whatever, and Buddhism has its own sacred set of books, a little bit looser and much, much larger. But nevertheless, when you take it upon yourself to canonize a set of texts like this, you freeze the moral arc. If you believe that text is a perfect, inspired reflection of divine will. And then the moral arc can't move forward because you're constantly looking back and going, that's how God wants us to behave, like those tribal people in ancient Israel. But if you can assume that the texts we have are people's reflections on their experience of divinity, then we can look at those authentic expressions and say, we don't have to degrade them, we don't have to make fun of them, we don't have to mock them, but we can look at them and say, that's what they thought, and they may have even touched the divine if you believed that. But that doesn't mean that's exactly God's will for us always and forever. Maybe that's what they thought. And maybe God has showed us a better way through that long moral arc. We are now at a further point. And then the moral arc can continue. And then you can go back and take a text like this and you can say, I don't believe that's right. Right? That's not, there could be a story in here of somebody behaving bad, and you can point at it and say, I don't think we should commit genocide like Joshua did. That's probably not the right way to behave. It's not a godly way to behave. But I'm also don't have to look at that and say, the Bible is this horrid thing. It's a representation that begins with people committing genocide and ends with a story about Jesus telling you to love your neighbor. And so in the text itself, you can see the moral arc. And in fact, a lot of scriptural authors in most religious texts from around the world, from Buddhism to Hinduism to the biblical authors and to Judaism, they were written by almost what you would call radical reformers who, for the most part, pushed their moral arc forward. These texts don't necessarily hold you back. They push you forward. But then they hold you back if you hold on to them and don't accept further progress. So that's a long summary of kind of what we did with the book of Joshua. What I would consider the most important point to the book of Joshua. There was a lot of individual details like laws and covenants. Being strong and courageous was a major theme of the text. The text was very interested in this exclusive work of Yahweh, and it spent a lot of time trying to convince us that Joshua is a valid successor of Moses, and all this stuff. It was very interesting stories, very violent stories, but I think what we covered earlier with this kind of understanding of Scripture is the most important kind of takeaway from the text of Joshua. So today we're going to move on from Joshua to the book of Judges, and the two go together, so it's very important that we do that in the book of Judges. We're going to talk about authorship, dating. We're going to do some readings from the book selected. We're not going to be able to read the whole thing, but we're going to read a few of them. And we're going to save 3 of the major stories of Judges for next time. And next time won't be next month. I have a work conflict. But the following month, we'll finish the book of Judges. And there we will tell 3 of the big stories. So if you notice, a lot of these Judges, they get like 6 verses. And then suddenly you get Samson, who gets like 5 or something. So we're gonna tell those 3 major stories, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, in their own class next time. So today we just get to introduce the topic. The book of Judges is titled Judges in English, but this is one of those times where it's also titled Judges in Hebrew, Latin, Greek. And that's not always the case, right? Sometimes you get different names for these books, and it's useful to go through them. A lot of Hebrew texts are named by the first Hebrew word of the text, and that wouldn't make a lot of sense thematically in this case. And so instead we get this term Judges because the book has a major section about people who are called in the text judges. By the way, they're only called judges in about 3 verses. In chapter 2, verse 16 through 19, in what we're going to call the second introduction. That's the only time they're called judges. The rest of the times they're called, military leaders or whatever. So what they really are tribal leaders in a confederation of tribes. And they all get this title judges almost after the fact. But the text doesn't call them judges all the way through. But it's a good kind of way to refer to them. A better name for them might be deliverers, and we'll show you why in just a second. The contents of the book of Judges is the history of Israel from the death of Joshua, which we finished last time, to the rise of the monarchy in 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, we have 2 parts to the rise of the monarchy. First, this guy named Saul takes over and does a horrible job, and the text is very anti-Saul. And so you'll see Judges actually make reference to Saul obliquely, and you'll miss it if you don't know what you're seeing. But they will make references to places where Saul went, or places where Saul was born. And they talk about why bad things happened there in the past. And what they're really doing is kind of poking fun at Saul in the future. And so that's this kind of undercurrent to the text, is the text does not like Saul. The text really likes David. And so David is, of course, Saul's successor who takes over and unites the kingdom, and he's their mythical golden age king. Everything was right with the world when David was in charge. So to fix things, we need to get a king like David back on the throne. That's the main theme of the author. And so he tells the story of 12 judges who deliver Israel in the days before there was a king. So that's our content. Here's the outline of the book. We have 2 introductions. The first is in chapter 1, verse 1 through 2:5. The second is in chapter 2, verse 6 through 3:6. And then we have a section of 12 judges. And this section has specific refrains where and it will use the same words over and over for each of these kind of 12 judges. Not all of them, but for most of them, they will repeat these words. They'll talk about how they worshipped other gods. They'll talk about how God sold them to group A, who then oppressed them. And then the people cried out to the Lord. You'll notice these terms, cried to the Lord. These are things that we saw in the book of Exodus. So they're like mini repetitions of the Exodus. They became slaves to a group of people, this time not in Egypt, but a group of people in Canaan. Then they cried to the Lord called a deliverer who then delivered them. Then they had rest. The land had rest for 40 years, 30 years, whatever. And then after the land had rest, the people forget God and they start worshiping other gods again, and the cycle starts over. That's this first chunk in 3:7 through 16:3. 17 through 21 seems to be almost a different collection of stories. So there seems to be a late redactor who combines multiple sources together. That's why we have 2 introductions. We also have 2 chunks of stories. One that has these refrains that I just mentioned, and then we have this chunk in 17 that has a very different refrain. Its refrain is, in those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. And his point is, this is what happens. This is the garbage that people get up to when you don't have a king. This is how bad it gets. And so it tells very, very horrifying stories. And we'll get to those stories today. But that's this last chunk. And again, the point of the chunk is, this is what happens when you don't have a king, when things aren't the way they should be in this author's eyes. So in that middle section, we have our 12 judges. These are the 12, and each of them, you'll see some of them if you kind of pause this and look through the verses. Some of them only have a few minor verses. Some of them have several chapters. But the famous ones, Deborah, Gideon, and Samson are our famous one. We have other ones that are kind of fun that I just don't have time to get to, like the left-handed guy who makes a really short sword so he can hide it in his left pants pocket, and he reaches out, or his right pants pocket, but he can then draw it by his left hand, which is surprising because most people are right-handed, right? So he draws the sword with his left, and he stabs it into this really fat king, and he stabs him so far that the hilt goes in, and then, quote, the dirt came out. You can imagine euphemistically what actually came out. And so he then poops himself, and the story is almost certainly intended to be funny, if you find that sort of thing funny. But he delivers Israel by sneaking into the king's palace and slaying the king, probably while he's maybe sitting on the john, because then the people don't go in to find the king for hours because they think he's been on the john for hours. I don't know why he usually spends hours in the john, but there you go. And so this guy then escapes while people are, wondering where the king is. Delightful stories, of course. I apologize. I wish I could tell all of them because some of them are really fun, but we're going to have to kind of limit ourselves or we're never going to finish. Which is, I guess I've taken 33 classes to get this far. Maybe I shouldn't be afraid of not finishing. But I want to quote this in its entirety. This is a paragraph from Gregory Mobley's introduction to the book of Joshua in the New Annotated Oxford Bible for the NRSV in the 5th edition. And it says, in modern biblical scholarship, Judges has become increasingly central in several different areas of inquiry. In biblical archaeology, Judges is at the center of a contentious, and it is contentious, debate about the origins of the early history of Israel. And in feminist biblical interpretation, Judges has its vivid women characters and graphic depictions of violence by and against women. And that has become a central text for them. And with the growing interest in literary approaches to biblical study, Judges has been rediscovered as the neglected masterpiece of Hebrew literature. These really are some of the oldest forms of literature that we have access to, and they're very interesting from that kind of development of literary styles and techniques perspective. In fact, some of the earliest prose in the world is found in the Bible. We get a lot of poetry elsewhere, but some of the earliest prose tellings of history is the sort of thing, and you can question how historical some of the things they write are, but nevertheless, this kind of prose attempt to tell your historical story of a nation, this is one of the earliest forms of that sort of writing we see anywhere in the world. Major themes of the book of Judges. Now, it's written by, we presume it has multiple sources, right? That's why there's 2 introductions. So it's hard to talk about an author, but I think we can talk about kind of a compiler, the person who puts the story together and kind of puts the glue and cobbles it together. This seems to be the same person who wrote who compiled the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings. They are all kind of have similar authorship. And so the cycles are very similar, the themes are very similar. We have this cycle of deliverance. We have, this book explores the question of kingship, which will also come up again in 1 Kings and Samuel. But it has a very interesting exploration of the role of women. We'll talk about that. And then a special interest to archaeologists and historians is the origins of ancient Israel, which we just discussed is very mysterious. We're not quite sure what the real origins of ancient Israel are. We talked about during the book of Judges the fact that Israel doesn't seem to kind of come into the land all at once and take over the way Judges describes. Judges describes a genocide where people come from Egypt in the hundreds of thousands of millions and they slaughter everybody and they take over. And that is refuted by the archaeological evidence. Some of the cities that were supposedly destroyed didn't exist yet. Other cities that were supposedly destroyed weren't destroyed. And other cities that supposedly weren't destroyed were destroyed. And so the book of Judges has historical problems to it. However, the tale told in Judges almost is at odds with the story in Joshua. In Judges, the people are there living with the Canaanites, mixed together, and they're rubbing against each other, and sometimes the Israelites will oppress the Canaanites, as we would say it. I mean, they wouldn't see it that way, but we would say they're oppressing, actually making slaves out of their Canaanite neighbors. And at other times, the Canaanites are making slaves out of them, and they need to deliver to set things, quote, right, from the perspective of this author. So it's a very different story, a more gradual approach to Israelites slowly becoming the dominant force in the land, where they live with their neighbors and they and their neighbors fight in smaller kind of city-to-city skirmishes. And that seems to be, by the way, far more historically similar to what we actually see in the archaeology. That doesn't mean each of the stories are real, right? But this is more of an authentic match to the archaeology. So here's our cycle of deliverance. I think I already mentioned this, right? There's peace in the land, then Israel does evil. And in this case, almost always the evil they do is worshiping other gods. And so the Deuteronomistic author has this theme of you've got to worship just Yahweh, and any other worship is bad. And more importantly, worship of Yahweh outside of Jerusalem, outside of the Jerusalem temple, is bad. And so we'll see examples where people in Israel are worshiping Yahweh. They aren't worshiping him right from the perspective of the author, and therefore God gets mad. So not only do you have to worship Yahweh, you have to worship him right. And it's from the perspective of the compiler, he seems to be a priest from Jerusalem right after the temple was destroyed. And he's trying to say, you have to worship at the temple, and you have to have a king on the throne from the line of David. That's his thesis of what makes the world right, things right with the world. When you worship outside of Jerusalem, it's bad. At least when you worship with temple worship outside of Jerusalem, cultic worship, you can pray and things outside, but you're not supposed to sacrifice and have altars and temples and idols and things. That all has to happen in Jerusalem. And And so this is important from later developments like Christianity and the entire Jewish concept of the need for a Messiah. The Messiah is supposedly an anointed king from the line of David who will reestablish things the way they're supposed to be, put the temple back, put the kingship back, and put a king from the line of David back on the throne. That's the whole point of this whole messianic expectation that the Jews develop, and they develop it in part because of this book. So, again, they do evil. Almost always the evil they do is worshiping other gods. Then God punishes them by selling them to another place. They cry out to the Lord. God raises up a judge. Israel is delivered, and then there's peace in the land. Israel serves the Lord, and the land has rest, and then they do it again. The question of kingship. This is, for me, interesting because if you just kind of read the text and try to figure out what it's trying to say about kingship, it's kind of mixed, because the compiler is dealing with early ancient traditions from a time when there was no king. And the people back then were antagonistic to kingship. Now, the compiler could have done a couple things. He could have cut all that stuff out, right? Or he could have edited it and changed it. But to his credit, even though it seems to go against his thesis, he includes it. I think that should tell us something about the maybe validity or trustworthiness of the compiler. I'm not saying he's not a biased compiler, but he at least includes some of this anti-kingship stuff. And specifically, the most central argument against having a king is Yahweh is our king. We have a king. God is our king. And humans are not kings. Humans are vassals to God. Tribal leaders are vassals under a God who is our united God. On the other hand, the text goes out of its way to show us just how chaotic an environment without a king becomes. These tribal leaders, when they get attacked, they ask the other tribes, please come help. And the other tribes half the time says, nah, we're not interested. And so they're left to themselves. And then they lose. They lose battles because their other tribes are not united to help them win. Therefore, we need a king. And by the way, and the two last stories, which we will tell, are just so absolutely horrifyingly horrific that the point is, this is how bad it gets when you don't have a king. And it puts these two things up there and and that creates a mixed message that if you kind of try to synthesize it, it is, a king is really bad, but it's better than the alternative. Because we failed at letting Yahweh be our king. So we, being the weak people that we are, we need a king. And that seems to be its conclusion of the book, which then, of course, leads us into the book of Samuel when Israel gets a king. The role of women is very interesting in the text. For example, we get several of the heroes slay the enemies. Like, remember that guy that sneaks in and kills the really fat king with a short sword while he's hidden in his pants while he's on the John, probably. Here we get, there's a lady named Deborah, who's one of our judges, and she is listed as a prophetess, one of only 4 prophetesses. She has men under her who she commands to go to war, and they go. And she judges. She's the only one in this book who actually acts as a judge in the way that we would think of a judge, meaning sitting there and hearing disputes. It says she does that. Which means men came to her and said, I'm having a dispute with my neighbor, and she settled the dispute. That's huge. And by the way, none of the other judges actually do that. There are tribal leaders who go to war, whatever, but she's the only one listed as an actual judge in the sense we would have it. We also have these heroes who drive tent spikes into the evil king and slaying the evil king in the same way. The other guy, the man did it with the sword, and this woman does it with a tent spike. Have you ever heard the tent spike story? That's one of our stories we're going to do next month. I apologize. But very important story about a heroism of a woman who saves Israel. The one who really delivers Israel are women in this story. So the role of women, the traditional role of women, especially the traditional role of women that evangelical Christians might impose on us today, is challenged by these old texts. that claim that women can have greater roles of power and authority. It may be rare in ancient Israel, but it is not forbidden by God because she is actually one of the better judges in the text, and probably the only one that nothing negative is really even said about. She's a hero, start to finish, end of story. And all the others have these interesting flaws that they talk about. So again, I think this challenges our perception of, now, the biblical text comes from an ancient tribal society who are very patriarchal. There is no doubt there is sexism throughout the text. But the text also contains stories that intentionally challenge our view of what a woman is supposed to be and can do. And I think that those stories should kind of temper our view. All right. So that's what's in this book. When did it happen? We'll talk about whether it happened in a minute. But when did it supposedly happen? Well, here's the situation that describes the environment, and then we can look for a period when this environment is sort of actually happening. Yahweh was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. This is Iron Age stuff. And it is early Iron Age stuff because this is some of the very first application of iron. And iron was kind of the nuclear secret of the ancient world. If you know how to make swords and chariots out of iron, you beat your neighbors. However, iron chariot, and you kept it secret. You didn't tell other people how to do it. So the Israelites are probably using bronze weapons, and they have Canaanite neighbors with iron chariots. And of course, when they go up against that, they get beat. However, the iron chariots have a really hard time in the mountains. And so the Israelites live in the mountains. So here's what we know. Israelites in the mountains, Canaanites on the plains with chariots of iron. That fits very certain time periods. So I'm going to use the chronology from ancient Egypt because because we actually know the chronology from ancient Egypt. So it's a nice place to kind of tie things together and kind of figure out where things go. And we're looking right here, the New Kingdom and the third intermediate period. Now, what is an intermediate period? Well, and that's important, by the way, for what Judges is. Yeah, go ahead. What are the years? Oh, yeah, on this screen, you cannot see that, can you? About 1070 BC. Oh, sorry, here, let's go. 1550 to 1070 is the New Kingdom, and the intermediate period is from 1070 to 305 BCE. And so what seems to be happening in those time periods, what is an intermediate period? An intermediate period in Egypt is a time when Egypt is not united under a single dynasty. So England is united during the Middle Kingdom. Then they have an intermediate period, and then it's united again, and that creates the New Kingdom. And then they have an intermediate period, and then they have a Ptolemaic period when the Greek Ptolemies take over, and they're united again under the Ptolemaic rulers. So these intermediate periods, and there's three of them, the first, second, third intermediate period, and these intermediate periods are times of chaos when there are multiple kings in Egypt. Does that sound familiar? The book of Judges is an Israelite intermediate period. That's kind of what it is. Well, we know why the New Kingdom collapsed. Among other things, there were a group of people known as during the New Kingdom, Egypt controlled this area, and the description we have in the book of Judges doesn't make a lot of sense because Egypt should kind of be in control for a lot of it. But at the end of the New Kingdom and into the intermediate period, Egypt loses control of this area. And the reason is because of a group of people called the Sea Peoples. And here's a picture from an Egyptian temple of the Egyptians beating a group of Sea Peoples that they captured. We know the Sea Peoples are a mysterious force that the Egyptians suddenly began to face around this time period. And they threw the entire kind of ancient Near Eastern world into chaos about this time period. Major kingdoms collapsed, including the New Kingdom in Egypt, and left a power vacuum. By the way, we don't actually know who the Sea People are, nor do we know quite where they came from, but we're relatively sure the Philistines, who are mentioned for the first time in Judges, and they're one of the groups that the Israelites are busy fighting, we're pretty sure they're one of the Sea Peoples. They're people who came over the Mediterranean and settled along the coast. And so the Philistines live along the coast of Israel. And of course, today we get the term Palestine from Philistine, and that name was actually chosen, I believe, I used to know this history, but I think by the British specifically to poke fun, or not to poke fun, or no, it was chosen by the Romans they called the name Palestine specifically to needle the Jews by naming it after one of their ancient Israel enemies, the Philistines. That is not to say modern Palestinians are in any way related to the Philistines, but that's where their name came from. I think I've got that right. It's been a long time since I looked at that part of that story. So the Sea Peoples caused this collapse. They do so around 1200 BCE. And also around 1200 BCE, there is an explosion in population in the hill country. And they have a very distinctive architecture. Now, there is some circularity here. We assume architecture of this style, we call it the four-room longhouse, but it's not actually, always 4 rooms in anyway. But there is a distinctive archaeological style. It's a more complicated story that shows up in the hill country. We assume that archaeology is Israelite. Then anywhere we see that archaeology, we assume that's an Israelite settlement. And then, of course, everywhere we see the 4 rooms, we see Israelite settlements. But that's in some senses circular. So it's possible we're misinterpreting this data, but it seems to fit because this stuff appears around 1200 BC in the hill country, right where this is why the book of Judges is central to this debate about Israelite origins, because it describes something very similar to what we're seeing in the archaeology. At the same time, it tells what we would consider mythical stories of a really super strong Superman who rips up city gates and carries them miles away on his shoulders, which I'm pretty darn sure didn't happen. So the degree to which, so that raises these very interesting questions. The other problem with this is that if you just add up the judges' reigns, you get 480 years, which would put the time period of the book of Judges from about 400, I'm rounding to the nearest 100, but about 1400 to 10,000 BCE when the monarchy sort of begins. The problem is, for 200 of those years, the New Kingdom's probably in the way, and that's also before we see in the archaeology this explosion of culture and buildings and population in the hill country, which we interpret to be Israelite settlements. If we're right that those are Israelite settlements, then it actually, the time period that Judges recalls, Judges may not be telling us actual stories, but it at least recalls a time before the United Monarchy when there was a tribal confederation that was chaotic. That time period really existed, okay? So that time period archaeologically seems to be from about 1200 to 1000, but the text we have says 1400 to 1000. That 1400 also would be a problem for Exodus stories. We've talked about Exodus historicity, right? It pushes the Exodus way too far back. So what do we do? Well, one answer is to assume that the judges exist concurrently, right? Well, the first is that they remember a chaotic time in their history, and the individual stories are not historical at all, and then you don't have a problem. The other approach, though, is if you think there's more history going on here than that, you could assume that the judges reign concurrently. And by the way, that's what we see in Egyptian king lists. When the Egyptian king lists get to an intermediate period, they will list dynasties that reigned at the same time and put them one after each other, as if they were one after the other and as if they all ruled all of Egypt, because they don't want to even admit that they were divided. And so it wouldn't be terribly surprising if judges from the book of Judges actually, 2 of them were judging. There's a lot of these stories that could happen at the same time in different places. And that would allow us to compress the timeline to something that makes more sense, which opens the question to how much of this is historical. Obviously, Adam, Noah, we know those are myths. The book of especially Noah, Noah's Ark, we have good, solid reasons why, if there was a real Noah, which there could have been, the story we have today is mythical about him. Abraham, probably mythical, but may have historical roots. Exodus, we talked a long time ago about possible historical roots for the Exodus story, but now at least part of that story is mythical. David and Solomon, we know that the kingdom of David and Solomon, if it existed, did not extend to the size claimed by the text, but that doesn't mean there was no king named David. In fact, now this is an opinion, and it's a contentious one, so this is not at all something that there's a consensus for, but in my opinion, every king in southern Israel talked about being from the house of David, and we know that. We have archaeological inscriptions from these later kings where we know we're in historical territory. These people really lived. We have their names, we have their dates, we have things that they built, right? We have coins from them, all this stuff. And they all talk about being of the house of David. That tradition started somewhere. So David and Solomon, it's entirely possible that there was a historical David and Solomon, but their tales are exaggerated. That would be my opinion, but that is open to debate because we don't have any contemporary mentions of David and Solomon, but we do for the later kings. So the later kings were in historical territory. David and Solomon, maybe. Joshua and Moses, probably closer to the mythical side, and then we get to Judges, and we're kind of, right, Judges sits right at this place where we can't tell if we've reached kind of into the historical realm or not. And so this stuff we've discussed earlier about the years and the rise of the archaeology, these are things that are debated ad nauseum today, and they're the crux of a very contentious ongoing debate about the origins of Israel as described. And it's far more complicated than I can cover here, and that I even understand enough to speak rationally about it. Authorship, I mentioned this, it's part of what we call the Deuteronomistic history. Remember our JEPD stuff from Exodus. If you don't, you weren't here for that, that's okay. But JEDP were authors from our Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the book of Deuteronomy. D is the author of the book of Deuteronomy, and he seems to also be related, at least, to the author of what we call the Deuteronomistic history, which includes Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. So we're right in the middle of this historian's take, the Deuteronomistic history. There's a lot of unique aspects in D, like who they name is different characters have different names in D. They also have very specific phrases they like to repeat. We think it's related to Josiah and the book of the law. That's another story which we will cover in greater detail. If you don't know that story, that's fine, but Josiah claims to have discovered a book of the law in the temple, and we think that book of the law is probably book of Deuteronomy. So somehow Josiah is connected to, or at least some early form of the book of Deuteronomy. So Josiah and people who think like Josiah, centralized worship, etc., are connected. And that is why the entire Deuteronomistic history has this covenant and devotion to God is a main theme, framed as a treaty between a vassal and their king. This is why we have a king. Yahweh is our king. You see how this fits into the worldview of the Deuteronomist. And he also has a transactional view of history. If you do the right thing, God will bless you. If you violate the laws, you will be cursed. You see how that fits to the cyclical pattern? That is a very Deuteronomistic view of the world. It is also kind of a dangerous view of the world because I know people, maybe you get cancer, something bad happens to you, and you're like, well, I must have sinned. If I was righteous, this bad thing wouldn't have happened to me, because if I'm righteous, I'm blessed. And God promises that in the Deuteronomistic history. So where does the Deuteronomistic history get this view? It comes from the fact that we think they're writing or compiling texts from some time just at and then later added to after the fall of Judah to Babylon. So after the exile is the word I was looking for. Right after the exile. And so what we have is a group of people who are scratching their heads and saying, how did this happen? God promised David he would have a king on the throne forever, and yet Jerusalem is sacked, our king was taken captive, we're all slaves in Babylon. How did this happen? And the answer, we worshipped Yahweh wrong. Canaanite pagan worship, idol worship, idolatry, these things led us, they're extreme monotheists, so these things led us astray, and because we were worshiping Yahweh wrong, Yahweh allowed us to be taken captive. But if we repent, you see, telling these past cycles is part of the hope for the future cycle they see, right? We're taken captive into Babylon, but if we repent like they did in the Judges, God will raise up for us a deliverer who will bring us back to Israel, reestablish the Davidic monarchy. And again, here's where all the messianic future the future hopes of a future Messiah come from. Is we want to run that cycle one more time, and they're writing from the side of the cycle where they were destroyed, and they're explaining that destruction as disobedience to Yahweh, and therefore encouraging the people that they're writing to be faithful to Yahweh so that we can go home and have a Messiah who will bring us home. Which, of course, gives us the dating, right? Other arguments just within the text. For example, we have this passage in 1830. They were priests in the tribe of the Danites until the time when the land in the north went into captivity. He's talking about the captivity of the northern tribes. That happened in 730 BCE. So the book itself refers to later events, not in a prophetic way either. It's like this happened, and this is true until the time when. So for them, that event was in the past. So you know it's at least after 732 BCE. But if you assume the whole Deuteronomistic history was written together, or compiled at least together as a book, then we get events all the way up to the exile, which is far more likely. But just within the book of Joshua, you can push it back at least to this period. And by the way, that means it's, 300-400 years after the events it describes. So this is very important. This book was written at least 300 to 400 years after the event described, maybe 5 or 6, right? It was written many, many, many years after. And what it's doing is taking oral traditions about what happened and maybe some written sources and combining them together and putting it forth a story that has a narrative to it to explain why things are the way they are. However, that doesn't mean the entire text is that old. Judges chapter 5 is a song or a poetic, either a poem or a song, called the Song of Deborah. And it is considered by some authors to be the oldest book in the Hebrew Bible, the oldest text in the Hebrew Bible. And they're basing that on this idea that the text has archaic grammar and archaic vocabulary. And its structure is just very strange. Its contents looks more like a Bronze Age hymn to a Canaanite goddess than it does a later Iron Age text. So in both composition, form, content, it looks really, really, really old. And it's the telling of Deborah's story happens twice, once in prose and then once again in this poem. So you get her story twice. This telling of the story may be the oldest text in the Hebrew Bible. It's really old stuff. And again, Deborah's next month, so next class, I apologize. But from a dating perspective, we have a very late text that incorporates a very old song. That being said, I want to caution people, because we should always be careful when we do this stuff. This is the Shabako stone at the British Museum. If you've ever been to the British Museum, go find the Shabako stone. It's off in the corner, and not many people think it's very interesting because everyone's really excited about the Rosetta Stone. But the Shabako stone is this early text about a god named Ptah who creates the universe. And it's written in really old-sounding Egyptian. And it claims at the beginning to have been written down, in the late kingdom period, very late period. But it says, hey, we found this old musty scroll, and we're copying the text of the scroll because it's a really old creation story. So they copy the text, and the text sounds really old. But as we have learned more about ancient Egypt, and by the way, most Egyptologists thought it was really old for many, many years. But as we've learned more about the history of ancient Egypt, we really realized it contains a whole bunch of anachronisms. It's still an ancient text from our perspective, right? But it's an ancient text that pretends to be even more ancient than it is. And they did that by intentionally imitating ancient Egyptian. So it's just like if I told you to imitate Shakespeare, some of you could do it to greater or lesser, not his poetic prowess, but Old English, right? You could do it to a greater or lesser degree. This author was fairly good at it, whoever they were, and they wrote a text that fooled a lot of scholars for many years. Just because Judges 5 sounds like Old Hebrew, it has old vocabulary, old grammar forms, doesn't mean it really is old. But because it's a song, a poem, we happen to know those are the things most easily preserved. Therefore, it would make sense. If you're going to preserve something that's really old, that's what it would look like, especially in an oral tradition. You sing songs and you remember them, and you pass them on to the next generation and the next generation, and they get remembered. So if this is as old as we think, it tells us very interesting things, and we will cover it next time, but a lot, and you've probably heard me say this before if you've seen my stuff on the evolution of monotheism in the early Israelite, the evolution of early Israel. It tells us things about where they thought Yahweh, their God, came from the south, tells us where Mount Sinai is. Very interesting and probably informative stories about the origins of Israelite religion. So it's very important if it really is as old as we think. So I think it's old, but we should be careful. The Shabbat Stone at least should give us a certain amount of pause in how certain we are about this stuff. So in the next 15 minutes, I love it, let's read chunks from Judges, if we can, very briefly, unfortunately. Judges 1, this is our first introduction to the book of Judges. Remember I told you there are two, and it begins after the death of Joshua. So Joshua's dead. The Israelites inquire of the Lord, who will go up and fight, ... Notice in verse 19, the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron. We've referenced that before, but that's where that comes from in this first chapter. And then in kind of 1 verse 27 through 24, there's a long list of all the people that Joshua's people did not drive out, that they had to live with. We have to live with these people. These are the people who are Canaanites who are living with us that we haven't conquered, haven't driven out, and so we have to live with them. And then in chapter 2, verse 1 through 5, this is part of that first introduction, an angel of the Lord, or speaks to the people, or the Lord himself speaks to the people through the angel and says, I brought you up from Egypt, but you broke my covenants, and so now I'm not going to help you anymore, and you're going to have to deal with these people you're living with because you're breaking your covenants, and this is why you're struggling. That's our first introduction. And by the way, notice that if we kind of divide the book up into what we think are sections, they don't follow our chapter headings at all. Chapter headings were written much later, and we believe, he decided, the person who picked the chapter headings decided that when the Lord starts speaking, that's going to be a new chapter, but we actually think that's part of the previous introduction down to verse 5. And the reason we think that is because of verse 6. Verse 6 starts over. When Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites I thought Joshua was dead. So what we're doing is we're starting over with another introduction to the text. So when Joshua dismissed the people, the Israelites went to their inheritance to take possession of the land. And Joshua, the son of the Nun, verse 8, died at the age of 110 years old. And then later on, verse 10, another generation grows up that didn't know the Lord. And so 11, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So what we first get here is our first cycle, but described in general terms, and then we'll have specific terms in a minute. And then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them, for the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning, and when the judge died, they would relapse and behave like their ancestors, and ... So that's our second introduction. I'm going to give you an example of the cycle by taking one of our minor judges and showing you the refrains that will be said over and over in the text, so you can see that this is why we believe this whole section is a coherent whole. It has these repeated refrains. Whereas the last few chapters are part of almost a different book. Just like we have two introductions, we have two sections of book as well. So let's do Judges 3, 7 through 11. So it says, I'm going to actually start in verse 6. They took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshipped their gods. This is the problem. Intermarriage, which in this case is considered a grievous sin to Israel, and worship of other gods. So in verse 7, the Israelites did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. There's our first refrain. Forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping the Baals, the lords of the Asherahs, and the Asherahs. The Baals are the lords, the male deities, and the Asherahs are the female deities, often associated with groves and trees and the like. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of the Cushite of Aram something, and the Israelites served him 8 years. I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of these Canaanite names. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the Israelites, who delivered them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and he went out to war, and the Lord gave the king, and the king of Aram, I believe this is it means like the twice cursed one or something is the name of the king. So they're not giving his real name, right? They're using a euphemism for him. I think that's this one. Of Aram into his hand, and he had prevailed over him, so the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel died. That's our cycle. And our cycle in 3-4 verses. And every judge will have that cycle with those repeated lines. I want to tell you now some of the more horrifying stories in this text. There's 3 of them, and I have 10 minutes. Jephthah. Jephthah is a judge who led Israel against the Ammonites, and he's known for his tragic vow, which led to the sacrifice of his only daughter. Chapters 10, verse 6 through 12, 7. Let's see if I can figure out which of these verses to read and which ones to skip. I had highlighted the ones I want to read, but I don't have time to read all the ones I picked, so let's see. So verse 6 of chapter 10, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. There's our cyclical pattern. Specifically, they worship other gods. So he sold them into the hand of the Philistines. Now we see the Philistines along the coast. So Israel cried to the Lord, verse 10. Skipping to verse 13, I will deliver you no more. This is God. I will deliver you no more. Go cry to the gods whom you've chosen. We've been through this cycle about 5 times by now, and God's kind of frustrated, and he says, I'm done with you. Go pray to the gods you deliver. Have them deliver you in your time of distress. And the Israelites say, no, we're sorry. Please take us back. And God says, okay, fine. And he raises up this dude named Jephthah. Jephthah, in chapter 11, the Gileadite was the son of a prostitute and a mighty warrior. And it tells this beautiful story about how his brothers are like, you're not the son of our mother, you're the son of a prostitute, so we don't want you anymore. So they kick him out, and he goes off and lives in kind of exile, but he's a mighty warrior. And so when they get in trouble fighting the Philistines, they go to him and they say, please come help us. And he's like, didn't you kick me out? And they're like, yes, we did, but we really want your help. And he's like, okay, fine, I'll come back and help you. This is kind of a great story. I love it. That part of it, anyway. He says, verse 7, but Jephthah said to the elders of Gilead, are you not the very ones who rejected me and drove me out of my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you were in trouble? Anyway, and then there's this back and forth with the king. He writes letters about who really should be, and it sounds a lot like the Palestinians, by the way, Philistines, for whatever super serendipitous reason, the letter back and forth is like, this land was originally ours, and then they're like, yes, but we've lived here for 100 years, and good Lord, they're fighting over the same stuff. And then verse 30, the letters back and forth fail. So diplomacy fails, they're going to go to war, and Jephthah, verse 30, Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, by the way, whoever could also be whatever, it's ambiguous. Specifically, it could be a person, it could be a thing, just whatever comes out of the house to meet me, but notice he didn't exclude who. I will return, if I return victorious from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, or when I return victorious, shall be the Lord's to be offered by me as a burnt offering and a sacrifice. Moron. Of course, what comes out of his house? His only daughter. So he's very unhappy. He rends his clothes and he says, what have you done to me? And the daughter's like, what? I came out to welcome you home. Why are you unhappy about this? And he's like, well, now I got to sacrifice you. And she says, okay, I'll take one for the team. And she says, I'm going to go out and let me bewail my virginity for 4 months or whatever, and then I'll come home and you can sacrifice, which he eventually does. Talk about Abraham and Isaac. Like, this is Abraham and Isaac, only you actually sacrifice the person. This story, I should point out, this story is read by people as an example of how bad the Bible gets, because specifically what? This is what God wants. God wants you to sacrifice human beings so that you can win wars. I think that's a misreading of the text. Now, the Bible commands genocide. It has horrible things in it. But this story is not condoned. This story is a fable that's supposed to teach you how not to behave. And by the way, the moral of the fable from our perspective is if you promise something really stupid, you don't do it. That's the moral we could take from it. The moral that was intended by the author is don't make stupid vows because you have to keep them. Because in their society, you do not break vows, period. Even if they're this horrific. So don't make stupid vows. So the lesson they wanted you to learn is different from the one we would learn because they're living in a very different culture that values things a little differently than we do. And again, I would say our view is probably superior. On the other hand, the seriousness with which they take vows is in some ways refreshing. It would be really nice if we kept our word a little bit more, and if we promised something, we did it, especially if we did it in a vow. And their society was built around this. I mean, if you allow people to break vows, this is like a legal contract. Their perspective was all of society would fall apart if we can't trust people to keep their contracts. Now, remember if you can remember all the way back to Abraham and Isaac, that story is about why God doesn't want human sacrifice when other gods might. And here we have a story where someone is sacrificed to God. But again, the text is not condoning this. This is a horrible thing from its perspective. And God doesn't stop it, though. I mean, he didn't send a ram and say, do this. It's like, you made this stupid vow, and I'm going to teach everybody from now on not to make stupid vows. And your story is going to be told from again and again and again to keep people from making dumb vows. I mean, what did he expect was going to happen? This is incredibly, incredibly stupid. All right. Chapter 17 and 18 is when we get out of this cycle and we get into the last two stories in the book. And they are, they seem to be from a different source, right? Their refrain is different. The refrain in these stories is, in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So they have a different moral, or a different refrain. Seem to be a different story. And they tell a story about a guy who has a home shrine, and his mother, I believe, has some money that's stolen from him, and he gets it back. And he says, I got this money back, but I'm going to give it back to you, mother, to be yours because I'm a good son. And her mother's like, no, I'm going to give it to you to be part of our home shrine. So he makes an idol out of it. And he has this whole thing set up, with idol and priestly clothing and the whole deal. He just needs himself a priest. So he finds a Levite and he says, come be my priest and I will pay you. Okay, meanwhile, the tribe of Dan fails to kind of keep a hold of their territory, so they migrate north. And on their way north, they go past this guy's house, and they take his priest and they take his idols with them. And they go and they just kind of rob this guy of his priest. And he comes after them and is like, please give it back. And they're like, are you kidding? We've got the swords, you don't. And so he goes home, and these guys steal this cultic object and their priest. And they set up a temple in a place called Dan. This is very clearly a story from the south making fun of the worship in the north, because the north has a temple to Yahweh in Dan with Levites acting as priests. And this story is intended to help us know why that temple is illegitimate. This is the South explaining why the temple in Dan is illegitimate. And it brings to mind a story later in 1 Kings, after the monarchy splits. Remember, under David and Solomon, there was a united monarchy. We haven't covered this history yet, but if you know this history, there's a united monarchy. And then right after Solomon dies, the kingdom splits in half. And we get this guy named Jeroboam, who's king in the north. And he thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they'll again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. And after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. And he said to the people, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. Notice he's not telling them to worship a different god. These are the gods that brought you up out of Egypt. So his idea is, these idols represent Yahweh. But remember, in later Israelite tradition, you don't use idols to worship Yahweh. So clearly this northern temple is illegitimate. And one he sets in Bethel and the other in Dan. So here's this story about these temples being built in Dan. And of course, back in Judges, we get this story about where the priesthood in Dan actually comes from. Again, further illegitimizing this northern temple. And by the way, here it is. You can excavate. You can go there. We can excavate the temple. It's there, and this is kind of what it looks like. Presumably, there was an altar there. The dimensions fit the dimensions described in Exodus for altars to the Lord. There's also this kind of a basin for washing, which looks very much like the Temple of Solomon, which had its basin for washing. But this was set up in the Hellenistic period, so it's a late addition to the temple, but it makes it look a lot more like the Temple of Solomon. This temple was operative can clear up into the Hellenistic period as a place people would go to worship Yahweh. Last story, and the worst. If you're willing to bear with me for another 5 minutes, this is the horrifying story of the dissected concubine, and that story is as horrifying as my title for it makes it sound. This is in chapter 19 to 21. And chapter 19 begins with, "And in those days there was no king in Israel, and a certain Levite resided in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim. But his concubine was angry with him, and she went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband set out after her to speak tenderly to her and bring her back." At least it has that line, or it would be even more horrifying than it is. But he seems to be trying to convince her to come back rather than just kidnapping her from her father. And when he gets there, her father's chummy, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so glad you came back. Heaven forbid I have this daughter who's married but isn't living with her husband anymore. So thank you for coming back and taking her off my hands," is almost the impression you get. Like I said, it's horrifying. And the father-in-law keeps him there late drinking and stuff, and he's like, "I got to go." And he's like, no, stay. And then each night he's like, "It's too late to go." So he stays the night. And he does this many, many times. And then finally the last time, they spend the whole morning partying and celebrating, and he's like, "I got to go." Presumably his concubine is coming with him because he talked tenderly to her, not because he just, who knows. It never mentions that part again. But he goes to get her. Presumably he's going home with her. Anyway, he has this party with her father, and then it's late in the day. Right? It's really late. And he's like, "I got to go." And the father's like, "It's too late. You won't get anywhere, before it gets dark." And he's like, "I'll go anywhere." So he goes somewhere and he stops for the night. And his servant's like, "We should stop here in Jerusalem." By the way, Jerusalem is not controlled by the Israelites at this point. Canaanites live there. He's like, "We should stop here. This is a good, safe place to go." He goes, "No, I want to stay with Israelites. I trust Israelites more, so let's keep going. And we'll stop in an Israelite town." And where does he go? He goes to an Israelite town, which is the town from which Saul is. Remember I told you this author doesn't like Saul? This is Saul's town, and it's Gibeah. He said to the servant, "Come, let us try to reach one of these places to spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah." And he passes on to Gibeah. And he gets there, and he's trying to stay in the square by himself. And an old man comes and says, "It's really not safe to stay in the square in Gibeah." And he's like, "This is Israel. Of course it's safe." He's like, No, you should not stay here in the square. Come with me to my house where it's safe." So he does. And while he's in his house, guess what happens? How many of you know the story of Sodom and Gomorrah? A bunch of people come to the house and start pounding on the door and say, "Bring out the man so that we can rape him." And so, again, the problem here isn't that it's males and males. The problem here is that they want to rape him. Again, we have the same situation I described in Sodom and Gomorrah, where hospitality doesn't allow you to kind of turn out someone you've taken under your roof. You have to protect him no matter what. So the guy's like, "Here, take my daughter, and you can even have this dude's concubine, but leave the dude alone." That's where it gets really bad, right? And then it says, the man, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." By the way, that is a line from Sodom and Gomorrah. "Do not act so wickedly. Since this man is my guest, do not do this vile thing. Here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out, ravish them, and do whatever you want to them. But against this man do no such a vile thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the men seized his concubine and put her out to them. And no, he seized her and throws her out the door. And they rape her and abandoned her throughout the night until the morning. And at dawn began to break, they let her go. And as the morning appeared, she came and fell down at the door of the man's house, where the master was, until it was light. And in the morning the master got up, opened the door, and he went out to find his way. And he sees his concubine lying at the door of the house, and he says, "Get up, we're going." But there was no answer. So he puts her presumably dead body on a donkey, and he takes her home. And when he gets home, he takes a knife. This is her lying at the door. He takes a knife. I've got other pictures, right? Carries her home. He takes a knife and he cuts her body up. This is great, right? And he could have sent a letter, but he decides to cut her up, and he sends her body parts to all the tribes. And he says, this happened in Israel. Remember how the story started? Why don't we stay in this Canaanite city? No, let's go to Israel. This happened in Israel. Can we allow this to happen? And I would ask the question, how did you let this happen? Right? But he's mad at the Israelites in Benjamin who did this horrifying thing. But I think we're intended to be mad at him. The author of this text does not look on him in a kind light. There's several times where it's very clearly, this man is not a good man. The way he treats her is not right. He thrusts her out to the people to be raped all day. And the word it used, ravished, all right. This is not condoned. Again, this story is often used to, why we tell these sorts of stories to kids, I'll never know, but this story is not condoned by the text. The text is trying to show you how bad it gets when you don't have a king, because no one is right in this story. The man is not right. The people in Gibeah are not right. They're busy raping somebody and murdering them. He's not right. The way he sends out a call to arms is not right. The way the Israelites then decide, okay, let's commit genocide. So they decide to go murder the entire tribe of Dan in retaliation. Which they do, I might add, and almost wipe them off the face of the map. And then when they're all done with this, they're like, oh my gosh, it was part of God's plan that there were 12 tribes. We really shouldn't eliminate Benjamin, but there's only a few Benjamins left, and we've killed all their women. So we need to find wives for them, or else one of the tribes is going to vanish. So they go off and they kidnap a bunch of women and it only gets worse, right? And then the story ends after just this 2 genocides, 200 stolen virgins, and 1 raped and dismembered concubine, and the end of the book of Judges. And that's it. Like that's how the story is. And what are you supposed to do with that? And then what are you supposed to do with the last verse? In those days there was no king in Israel, and all the people did what was right in their own eyes. And what the heck did they think was right in their own eyes? This story. This absolutely horrifying story. And again, the Bible has horrifying stories in it, but this is not one of those horrifying condoned stories. This is one of this is how bad it gets when you don't have a king. And by the way, I have friends who are libertarians, and they are religious libertarians who use the Bible to justify the libertarian perspective, and they need to read Judges, right? Because the author of Judges thinks that this is what happens without a government that is strong, in charge, and centralized. You need a king to stop this stuff from happening. Now, obviously, we might not want a king, but the libertarian dream ends this way in this text. And anyone who thinks the Bible supports their libertarian weird worldview has not read the text carefully at all. And this is how the story ends. With an Israelite civil war and an absolute, 2 genocides, a bunch of stolen virgins, and the refrain, this is not good. Next time we'll do the 3 stories. These are far more inspirational stories, at least some of them. Samson's quite a character. At least we have a fun character in Samson, even if he's terribly flawed. But Gibeah, 2 of the good judges, and then Samson, this terribly flawed judge. And then after the book of Judges, what's next? We have Ruth, which is this beautiful story of a woman that is interjected in the Deuteronomistic history. It's not part of it. It's a story from outside that's brought in because it fits kind of in this time period. And it tells the story of some of David's ancestors. And then we're ready to continue the Deuteronomistic history, which immediately jumps from that. The story I told now is at the end, right? Deborah and Gibeon are earlier. I'm doing this out of order, but it ends the way I just ended it. And then without the Ruth interjection, it jumps straight into the story of how Israel got a king. You see the author's point. This is what happens when you don't have a king. This is how bad it gets. And we're going to jump after that last refrain, which is repeated 4 times in the text, and then right at the end, the very last verse, so it's the last thing you hear, the very next part of the story is the story of Samuel who chooses a king for Israel. And this is why he chose a king for Israel, because this is how bad it got. All right, I hope to see you next time where we'll do this Deborah, Gibeon, and Samson story. And I want to give you a chance, if you have any thoughts, questions, it's okay if you don't, but if anyone wants to pipe up or ask a question, now's a good time. Yes?
I see some patterns that are literally taken from here to the present day captives of girls that were taken away in Israel and how they disappeared and they were kept. I mean, that was within our century.
Yeah. Not just, so the comment was these things happen today, especially the captive women. By the way, Boko Haram in Somalia, but also Hamas in Israel. This idea of kind of taking captives, and in this case they're taking captives and giving them to another group of people that they just almost wiped out, and now they're giving them women so that they basically stolen so that they don't, die out. And of course, how historical that is an open question, but notice what the author's doing. That's Gibeah. That's where Saul's from. No wonder Saul is a bad king. But, other comments? All right, so further resources. If you're looking for more or to better understand these texts, because it's very important, this text is very foundational to the origins of Israel, so it's important to spend some time. If you're interested in the history, at least, this is a book that is very important. As horrifying as some of the stories are, it's a very important text. So I recommend Season 6, Episode 233 of the Bible for Normal People. This is Pete Ruin's Judges. He also ruins, Exodus, Leviticus, Genesis, Numbers, Samuel, For those who are interested, he's got a podcast on all of those. Especially from the believer's perspective, this is a great resource. I benefit, I've been reading from this text, but the introduction to the book of Judges in this text was incredibly useful. It was like 2 pages, but it was really succinct, had great information. Yes. Yes, I'm holding the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha, New Revised Standard Edition, 5th edition with the New Revised. Anyway, it's too many texts in there. But I found that incredibly useful. The footnotes are great, but the introduction in this case, I even quoted from it earlier for the significance of the book. It was very excellent. I made a lot of use of it. I grew up using the Anchor Bible commentary, and this is the old one from 1974, so it's older than I am by a year. They have a new one. I haven't used the new one, but I'm assuming it's good because it's from kind of the same source. Unfortunately, these books are like $50 each. I keep hoping I can convince the library to carry these, so you can go check them out. But this commentary series is very good, or used to be, and I have some of the earlier texts. Once we finish with Judges and maybe Ruth, I'm going to take a break from Bible and I'm going to go back to comparative religion. We really need to do Islam. It's a shame how many years I've been doing this. We don't have a class online, at least, about Islam. But I really also am very excited to do how Jesus became God, how Satan became the devil, and kind of to go through the evolution of those concepts from their earlier roots. We've covered some of these other traditions, but we've never kind of we've always been, this is a Mesopotamian tradition, this is an Egyptian tradition. We've never said, these are all the traditions related to this concept, and kind of told that story in its evolutionary form, and I think we should, because it's very interesting when we do. All right, that's what's coming. I hope to see you next time. I hope that what we've shared today helps you on your life's journey in some way, and I hope to see you next week, or next month after next. Thank you.